You won't regret it, I promise. Subscribe. My name is Richard Collins, and I will begin with a confession. I thought silence was a form of wisdom. For years, I told myself that measured pauses and quiet tolerance were signs of strength. But in truth, silence can rot you from the inside. Silence makes the world believe you have nothing left to say. And when your own son stands in front of a boardroom in Boston and calls you unfit, silence becomes a coffin you build for yourself. That morning was bright, a brittle October morning when the air along the Charles River cut like glass. I remember the sunlight catching on the slate rooftops of Cambridge, the glitter on the water, the dry crackle of leaves when I stepped out of the car. And yet, when I walked into that boardroom mahogany paneled, the walls lined with framed photographs of past company milestones, I felt the chill of winter, as if every window had been thrown open. David was already there. My son. He stood at the head of the long, polished table, shoulders squared, his tie in that perfect half-Windsor knot the one he had once asked me to teach him, the irony cut. He didn't look at me when I entered. His eyes were fixed on the council, the men and women who had once been my peers, my companions through decades of building this company from nothing more than a small logistics firm on the South Boston waterfront. And then he said it. Father is no longer capable of leading this company. For the sake of stability, I will assume full control. No tremor in his voice, no hesitation, just those words, delivered as though they were inevitable. I should have spoken. God knows I should have. But my throat closed, as if betrayal itself were pressing a hand over my mouth. I looked around the table, expecting anyone to object, but I saw only lowered eyes, tight jaws, and the subtle shifting of papers. Some believed him, some simply wanted to. Perhaps they were tired of me. Perhaps they saw in him the vigor they once saw in me. Do you know the pain of being erased while still alive? It is worse than death. At least the dead are remembered. I stayed silent. I sat there, my hands trembling under the table where no one could see, and let him speak over me. That was my weakness. Not his betrayal, not their betrayal mine. Because in my silence, I agreed with them all. Afterward, I walked out of that room like a man condemned. The corridor outside the boardroom stretched endlessly, portraits of past directors staring down in judgment. My footsteps echoed off the marble. I passed the receptionist, a young woman who had once greeted me with warmth, now giving me only the polite nod reserved for fading relics. I could have gone home. I could have retreated to my townhouse on Beacon Hill, poured myself a drink, stared at the oil paintings my wife had chosen decades ago, and tried to forget the humiliation. But something in me refused to collapse entirely. My legs carried me instead into the city streets, almost on instinct. Boston, my city. Or at least I used to believe so. I walked across the public garden, where swan boats rested unused in their boathouse, the trees already shedding yellow leaves onto the pathways. A man was playing saxophone near the bridge, the sound jagged and lonely, each note bleeding into the brisk air. I sat on a bench and listened, clutching my cane though I didn't need it. My body still worked. It was only my place in the world that had been crippled. That was when I realized, sitting there in the open, among strangers who did not know my name, who did not know that I had just lost my life's work, I realized the scale of my foolishness. I had spent decades believing that legacy was something automatic, something guaranteed if you built enough, earned enough, provided enough. I thought respect was the natural reward of endurance. But legacy can be stolen. Respect can be redirected. Even blood can betray. That evening, after wandering through the crooked streets of Beacon Hill, past the gas lamps flickering against brick facades, I found myself in front of my own door without memory of how I got there. My wife's voice greeted me faintly from inside. She was humming in the kitchen, as if nothing had shifted, as if the world had not just collapsed. I went straight upstairs, closed the study door, and sat among the relics of my career, framed contracts, letters of commendation from governors, photographs of ribbon cuttings. Dust had begun to gather on them. I hadn't noticed before. Dust creeps quietly, like betrayal. And I thought, this is how invisibility begins. Not with death, but with dust. Do you think I exaggerate? Do you believe an old man is being dramatic? That the son was simply ambitious? and the father too weary to fight? Perhaps, but imagine the knife of it, your own blood calling you unfit, and the world nodding along. Would you not bleed too? I poured a glass of scotch, my old ally, and stared at my reflection in the window. An old man, yes, but not finished. Not yet. And the words David had spoken kept replaying, a refrain, a curse. Father is no longer capable. That night, after the glass was empty, I put on my coat and walked again, this time to Boston Common. The October wind was sharper now, carrying with it the smell of burning wood from some unseen chimney. College students passed by in clusters, laughing too loudly, their youth a kind of cruelty against me. I sat on another bench, this one under a bare elm tree. And there, in the solitude of midnight Boston, I made a choice. I would no longer be silent. I would no longer be invisible. David thought he had cut me out. What he didn't know was that in my silence, I had preserved something greater than my voice. You see, over the years, I had allowed him to believe he was the clever one, the strategist, the natural successor. I let him believe I had grown careless, inattentive. But what kind of man builds an empire and leaves himself with nothing? What kind of fool does not guard the final card in the deck? I was not a fool, not yet. And so the premise of my new life, my second life, was set that night in Boston Common, beneath the brittle October stars. I would not beg for my place. I would reclaim it, not through loud protest, but through the quiet, deliberate hand of a man who has nothing left to lose but his dignity. When I rose from that bench, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not happy, not healed, but sharpened, like a blade rediscovered at the back of a drawer. And perhaps you will think me cruel for what comes next. But tell me, would you have done differently? Would you have accepted erasure by your own son, smiled politely, and faded into the wallpaper of your city? I will not fade. Not in Boston. Not in this life. And certainly not under the shadow of my own blood. The night I chose not to die of humiliation, Boston Common was almost empty. A few silhouettes moved quickly along the paved paths, wrapped in coats, hurrying home to warmth. The elm branches rattled overhead like dry bones, and the wind off the Charles carried the metallic smell of river water and distant industry. I sat there until the city grew quiet enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. It sounded like a drumbeat for war. I had spent my life believing my enemy would come from outside competitors, politicians, the unpredictable storms of economy. But enemies inside the family are different. They don't attack outright. They smile at you over Thanksgiving dinner. They kiss you on the cheek. They ask about your health, and all the while they sharpen their knives. And David had cut me clean. My only son. That was the moment something hardened in me, the way water hardens into ice overnight. A truth I had avoided for too long rose up without mercy. My silence, my hesitation, had made him believe I was weak. He mistook patience for senility, trust for incompetence. That was my fault, wasn't it? What kind of father raises a son who sees kindness as weakness? You may think me too harsh. You may think he's just ambitious, Richard, just young. But ambition without respect is parasitism, and parasites need a host. I would not be his host. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I rarely slept much these days, but that night there was no trace of fatigue in me. I shaved, put on the same navy suit I had worn to countless board meetings, tied my own tie slowly, carefully, the way I once taught David. I ate nothing. Hunger seemed like an indulgence I could not afford. Instead of heading to the office, I walked through Harvard Square, past the cafes opening early for students and professors. I stopped at one I hadn't entered in years, a narrow place with chipped tables and chalkboard menus. The kind of cafe where anonymity felt natural, where half the room smelled of burnt espresso and damp coats. I chose a corner table and ordered black coffee, and then I waited. Do you know what it means to wait not for someone, but for the right kind of chance? That was me. Staring at the fogged window, watching Cambridge wake up, I began making lists in my head names of old allies, colleagues who owed me favors, professors who had once courted donations, men and women who had long memories of what I had built. I had ignored them for years, retreating into the illusion that my family was enough, that David was. But blood had betrayed me, and so I would return to the only currency that never lies: leverage. By mid-morning, I made my first call. It was to Lawrence Bennett, an old partner, retired now, who still carried weight in the logistics trade associations. He answered with surprise, then with warmth. Age has a way of softening the grudges between men. We agreed to meet the following week. Then another call to Maria Fletcher, once a young attorney in our legal department, now a partner in a firm downtown. She had not forgotten the letter of recommendation I wrote for her 2 decades ago, nor, it seemed, the lesson I gave her once. Contracts are written twice, once in ink, once in blood. Don't ever forget which one lasts longer. She laughed when I reminded her. We arranged lunch. Each call lit something in me that had been dormant. I wasn't pleading for relevance. I was reclaiming it, name by name, tie by tie. Meanwhile, David strutted. He held meetings with the confidence I had once admired in him, though now I saw it for what it was: performance. My secretary, well, not mine anymore, but she still slipped me tidbits out of loyalty, told me how he boasted to the board about streamlining operations, about a new era of leadership. The words sounded hollow, but they were enough to dazzle the short-sighted. Let him preen, let him play king. The longer he thought I was finished, the deeper I could work. At night, I walked again through the city, letting its streets remind me of my history. The brick warehouses along the waterfront, once shabby, now converted into gleaming offices. Our company had started in one of those warehouses. I had stood there as a young man with dirt under my nails and big ideas in my chest, and I had said to myself, Boston will know my name. Boston did. And then, slowly, Boston forgot. But the city, like me, is built on layers. It buries, but it does not erase. One evening, I found myself standing in front of our first headquarters, a 3-story building on Atlantic Avenue. Red brick, its windows glowing with some startup's lights now. I touched the wall like it was the flesh of an old friend. A cab driver waiting nearby gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. That building remembered me, even if my son wished to erase me. Do you understand what I'm saying? Places have memory. Documents have memory. And so do men. It was then the idea came, sharp as broken glass. I had been silent for years, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. I had preserved pieces of power that David didn't even know existed. Trust funds in shell companies. Land rights buried in contracts. Votes attached to shares he thought I had surrendered, but had merely redirected. I smiled, standing there on Atlantic Avenue. For the first time in months, I smiled. What David didn't know, what no one in that boardroom had bothered to ask, was that the old man still held the final card, and I would not play it until the perfect moment. Autonomy, a word I had not spoken in years. Marriage, fatherhood, partnership, company, they blur a man's edges until he forgets he ever stood alone. And then betrayal arrives, and suddenly the word becomes a weapon. Autonomy, the right to act, to decide, to live without permission. The weeks after David's coronation were a study in humiliation. He paraded himself at board meetings, delivered speeches at industry dinners, let reporters describe him as the new face of Collins Maritime Logistics. They photographed him against the skyline, his hand gripping a railing, his jaw angled like a movie star. My name was mentioned only in passing. Founder emeritus, longtime chairman now retired. Retired, as if I had shuffled off to Florida to play golf. I read those articles at the kitchen table on Beacon Hill, the paper trembling in my hands. My wife tried to soften it. "Richard," she said gently, "maybe it's not so bad. You've worked long enough. Perhaps it's time to rest." Rest. As though rest were dignity. As though watching my son devour everything I built could ever be peaceful. I said nothing, only folded the paper and stared at the silverware, each reflection warping my face into something grotesque. But outside that townhouse, I was moving. I began with contracts old, dusty agreements I had signed 20 years ago and tucked away. I spent long afternoons in the Boston Public Library, under those vast green reading lamps, my fingers turning pages of bound volumes no one else had touched in decades. Clauses appeared like hidden veins of ore, rights of first refusal, land use stipulations, forgotten percentages of shares assigned to entities only I knew existed. They were mine still, not lost. Do you see the power of paper? People think power lies in charisma, in youth, in loud speeches. But paper endures. Paper outlives blood. By evening, I would walk across Copley Square, the church bells chiming, the wind lifting the smell of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor. I watched people hurry past, their coats flaring behind them, and thought, none of them know the war being prepared among the stones of this city. None of them know an old man, written off as finished, is sharpening his silence into a blade. My allies grew, quietly. Lawrence Bennett introduced me to 2 retired executives who still held voting shares. Over lunch at the Union Oyster House, we spoke carefully, the clatter of dishes covering our words. They were not fond of David. Arrogant, one said, cracking open a lobster claw. Thinks history began the day he took the chair. Their discontent was oxygen to me. I promised them stability, dignity, continuity, words men of their generation still respected. Maria Fletcher proved even more valuable. Over coffee in her glass-walled office, overlooking the financial district, she leaned forward and said, "Richard, they underestimated you. That's your advantage. Let them think you're finished. In the meantime, I'll make sure the foundations remain in your name." Her confidence steadied me. She was proof that loyalty can cross decades. Meanwhile, I tested myself in smaller ways. I forced myself to walk without my cane, to climb the steps of the State House without pausing for breath, to attend a lecture at Harvard on maritime law and ask a pointed question in front of the students. Eyes turned toward me, curious, some respectful, some pitying, but I was there, present, seen. Do you know how intoxicating it is to reclaim visibility? To feel the city recognize you again, if only for a flicker? And yet, each step forward carried the bitter taste of what had been lost. One Sunday, I attended church alone at Trinity, the stained glass windows casting colored light over bowed heads. I prayed not for forgiveness, but for clarity. I asked whether vengeance was sin or whether it was simply justice under another name. The silence that answered me was like every other silence in my life, heavy, ambiguous, forcing me to decide alone. I decided. One evening, passing through the North End, I stopped at a bakery. The air was thick with sugar and coffee, the windows fogged by heat. Families crowded inside, children licking cannoli cream from their fingers. I sat at a small table with an espresso and listened, not to the families, but to myself, to the pulse of my plan forming. I realized then, David did not merely take the company. He took the narrative. He told the world I was finished, and the world believed him. To defeat him, I had to retake not just assets, but story. I had to show the city, the industry, even the family, that Richard Collins still existed not as a ghost, but as the author of the final chapter. So I began to speak again, carefully. A word at a dinner party here, a remark at a fundraiser there. The David's new initiatives are bold, I would say, pausing just long enough for doubt to slip in. But boldness, as you know, isn't always wisdom. Nothing more, just seeds. Seeds grow. At night, I dreamed of the boardroom again, the long table, the glass wall overlooking the Charles, David's voice declaring my incapacity. But in the dream, I rose. I stood, and the table shifted, the walls dissolved, and it was him who trembled. I would wake with sweat on my chest, my fists clenched around the sheets, my wife stirring beside me, unaware of the battles raging in my sleep. Boston itself seemed to echo my journey. The old brick facades downtown had sleek new startups inside. History dressed itself in modern clothes. I walked past Faneuil Hall one cold evening and thought, this city remembers revolutions. It knows what it means to cast off false kings. And so did I. One late afternoon, I stood once more on Beacon Hill, looking down toward the State House dome, gleaming gold against the autumn sky. For the first time since David's betrayal, I felt something close to calm, because I understood. My weakness had been silence. Yes, but now silence was my weapon. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of preparation. David would not see me coming, and when the time arrived, it would not be loud. It would be a single gesture, a single document, a single phrase. That is how real power moves, not in noise, but in inevitability. And perhaps you think me cruel or foolish or both. Perhaps you believe fathers should forgive sons, no matter the sin. But answer me honestly. If your child declared you useless, erased you from your own creation, stood on your bones to elevate himself, would you bow? Would you smile and fade? I think not. I walked home through the darkening streets, the lamps flickering on one by one, and I whispered to myself, so softly, even the wind could barely hear it. Not yet, David. Not yet. But soon, the ballroom smelled of money. You may think money has no scent, but I assure you it does. A mixture of polished wood, expensive perfume, starched linen, and the faint metallic tang of ambition. It was the annual shareholders' assembly of Collins Maritime Logistics. Though, to hear David tell it, it was his coronation ball. Chandeliers dripped light across the room. Men in tuxedos, women in black silk dresses, crystal glasses of champagne. The hum of conversation was constant, punctuated by bursts of laughter, the clinking of cutlery against plates. The place was the very definition of Boston's corporate vanity, an old hotel near Copley Square, its walls lined with oil paintings of statesmen long dead, its ceiling carved with flourishes meant to remind everyone of tradition, continuity, permanence. Tradition, continuity, permanence. Words David thought he had stolen from. I entered without announcement. My suit was black, understated. My tie the deep red I always wore at decisive meetings. Some turned their heads when I walked in. Others looked through me, as though I were only a relic who had wandered in by mistake. But just a few straightened in their chairs. They remembered. David was at the podium. He had the gift of performance. I'll grant him that. His voice carried easily, his gestures rehearsed but convincing. This company is entering a new era, he declared, his hand raised as if to lift the room with it. An era of efficiency, innovation, and forward-looking leadership. They applauded. My son, glowing under the chandeliers, smiled like a man who believed his throne secure. I found a seat at the back, near the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest. I had spent weeks preparing for this, months gathering my quiet strength, but still age is not kind to nerves. My fingers tightened around the armrest. For a moment, I nearly faltered. What if I was wrong? What if silence had weakened me beyond repair? Then I remembered the bench at Boston Common, the October wind, the promise I made to myself not to fade. I remembered the dust on my framed contracts, the clauses I unearthed in the library, the allies I'd summoned from the corners of the city. I remembered every humiliation I had swallowed, every time my own blood had spoken over me. I stood, not quickly, not with drama, slowly, deliberately, like an old man rising simply because he must. Conversations dimmed, a few heads turned. David's voice faltered, just a fraction, then continued, but I kept walking forward. The carpet muffled my steps. The chandeliers gleamed above me. At the edge of the stage, I stopped. My son froze at the sight of me. For the first time in months, he looked uncertain. I took the microphone. My voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried. Years of boardrooms had taught me how to let a quiet voice fill a room. I may be old, I began, and the words settled over them like dust falling, but I still hold the majority of this company. And tonight, I vote silence. Absolute silence. You cannot imagine how loud it was. Glasses half raised froze mid-air. The chandeliers seemed to stop shining. Even the waiters paused in their steps. David tried to laugh. "Father," he said, "surely this isn't necessary." But I did not let him finish. "You told them I was finished. You told them I was incapable. But you forgot, David. That legacy isn't given. It is held. And I still hold it." I produced the documents prepared with Maria Fletcher's careful hands, detailing. The shares he had assumed were his. The trusts he had overlooked, the clauses he had ignored. I laid them on the podium. My hand did not tremble. The room erupted, not in applause, not yet, but in murmurs, sharp and electric. The board members leaned toward each other, whispering, scanning the papers, recalculating the balance of power in an instant. David's face flushed red. "You can't," he began, but the words stuck. He looked like a boy again, cornered, his certainty crumbling. I looked him in the eye, and I asked the question that had burned in me since that boardroom betrayal. Who gave you the right to erase me? No answer. There never would be. I turned back to the room. I vote for continuity, for stability, for leadership that remembers where we came from before deciding where to go. And if you believe otherwise, then let us put it to the vote now, before the eyes of this city. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. And then someone clapped. A slow, deliberate clap from the back. Then another. Then more. It was not thunderous, not unanimous, but it was enough. Enough to tell David that his reign, so confidently declared, was no longer unquestioned. I handed the microphone back and I stepped down. My chest ached, my legs shook, but I kept my back straight. The silence that followed me to my chair was louder than any applause I had ever received. Do you understand? It wasn't just about votes or contracts. It was about being seen again, about carving my face back into the marble before they had time to erase it. David sat frozen at the podium, the applause dying around him, the weight of the documents pressing on the table before him. His smile had vanished. His eyes darted across the room, searching for all eyes, finding fewer than he expected. And I sat in my chair, breathing steadily, my hands clasped, and thought, let him squirm. The city of Boston has seen many sons who believed themselves kings. It has also seen fathers who refused to die quietly. That night, I did not reclaim everything, but I reclaimed myself, and that was the beginning of his end. Do you know what happens after a battle ends? Not the next morning, not the speeches, not the photographs, but the private hours when the adrenaline drains out of you and you are left with nothing but your own thoughts. That's when the cost arrives. I walked out of the ballroom that night with a straight back and steady steps. But the moment I stepped into the Boston air, the weight of it all slammed into me. My chest hurt. My hands shook. The lights of Copley Square blurred in my vision as though the city itself was weeping. A driver offered me a car. I waved him away. I wanted to walk. The streets were damp from a passing rain, reflecting the golden dome of the State House in crook puddles. I passed Trinity Church, its stone dark and solemn, the square nearly empty at that hour. Boston has a way of watching you, of reminding you that your victories are only temporary, that the city will outlast you no matter how fiercely you cling to your place in it. And for the first time since David betrayed me, I felt not triumph, but sorrow. Because here's the truth I had avoided. I didn't lose a company that day in the boardroom. I lost a son. Or perhaps I had lost him years ago, when ambition first sank its teeth into him. Perhaps the father he admired became the rival he resented. Perhaps I mistook obedience for loyalty and silence for respect. I thought about the nights when David was a boy, when I brought home stacks of contracts and balance sheets. He would sit across from me at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, pretending to do his homework while sneaking glances at the numbers I scrawled. "Teach me," he used to say, his eyes bright, eager. And I did. I taught him everything I knew about margins and leverage, about risk and reward, but I never taught him mercy. Maybe I didn't know mercy myself. That realization struck like a knife. For decades, I told myself I was building for my family for him. Every contract signed, every expansion, every brick added to our empire was supposed to be a gift. But was it? Or was it my monument, my attempt to etch my name into Boston's granite the way the Adamses, the Kennedys, the Lowells had done before? If legacy was my true ambition, then I had raised him not as a son, but as an heir. And heirs are not loved, they are prepared. No wonder he turned on me. I walked until my legs trembled. I stopped at Boston Common, sat once more on that same bench where weeks earlier I had promised myself not to vanish. The elm tree above me was bare now, winter stripping it down to its bones. A man passed by with a dog, the leash taut, the animal tugging forward eagerly. The man laughed softly, pulled the dog close, whispered to it with affection. That sound pierced me more than David's words ever had. Affection. I had given my son responsibility, wealth, power, but affection? Perhaps too little, perhaps far too little. I lowered my head into my hands and let the truth settle. Winning the vote, humbling him in front of Boston's elite. That was not victory, that was necessity. But the victory I once imagined passing my life's work into his hands, watching him expand it, standing beside him as father and son was gone, dead. Do you understand what I am telling you? Revenge restores dignity, but it does not restore love. It cannot. I returned home long after midnight. My wife was waiting, a lamp lit by her chair. She looked at me, the way women look when they know their husbands have carried burdens too heavy to explain. She asked no questions. She only touched my hand and whispered, "You did what you had to do." Yes, I did, but it did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival. Over the next days, the city buzzed. Articles appeared in the Globe about the unexpected intervention of founder Richard Collins. Commentators speculated about fractures in the Collins dynasty. My phone rang more in that week than it had in the past year. Old associates congratulated me, hinted at alliances, whispered of support. But inside, I was hollow. I spent hours in my study, staring at the artifacts of my life, the photographs, the documents, the awards. They looked different now. Not trophies, but evidence in a trial I was holding against myself. And the verdict? Guilty. Guilty of believing work could replace intimacy. Guilty of thinking silence was love. Guilty of imagining legacy was the same as family. David's betrayal did not make me unworthy. It revealed what I had always feared, that my worth had been tied too tightly to what I built, and not enough to who I was. That was my self-revelation, bitter but cleansing. One afternoon, I walked to the waterfront, where the cold Atlantic slapped against the piers. The smell of salt and diesel filled my lungs. I thought of our first warehouse, of the nights I worked until dawn, of the sweat and hunger and raw determination that made the company possible. I thought of the young man I once was, and I wondered, would he be proud of the man I had become? Or would he shake his head and say, "You built an empire, Richard, but you failed to build a son"? Perhaps both. And yet, despite all this, something inside me refused to surrender to despair. Because while David's betrayal had shattered the illusion of family legacy, it had also freed me. I was no longer living for his approval, or for anyone's. I was living for myself. Do you see the irony? My greatest humiliation had become my liberation. I did not lose a son that night in the ballroom. I uncovered who he truly was. And more importantly, I found who I still am. An old man, yes. Flawed, guilty, wounded, but still capable of choice. Still capable of saying no. Still capable of rising. And if you think that too small a victory, then you have never been erased. I'll start with a scandalous truth. Victory is ugly up close. From a distance, it looks like a laurel wreath. In your hands, it feels like barbed wire. The morning after the shareholders' assembly, Boston wore its usual masquerade light over the Charles, a brittle wind shouldering between brick rows on Beacon Hill. Joggers negotiating patches of black ice like litigators parsing a contract. Newspapers named me founder resurgent. Columnists rediscovered their respect for my stewardship, and the photo they chose showed my chin lifted at the podium while David blurred behind me. If you knew nothing else, you'd say justice had a clean face. But justice, like the Charles in late November, is brown beneath the shimmer. I stood in my kitchen at 7 a.m. with the paper open beside a cooling cup of coffee. My wife sliced a grapefruit with that careful patience of hers. She did not look at me when she said, "They'll come." She meant calls, alliances, apologies with invoices attached. They did come. By 9 o'clock, the phone burned. Old board members wanted assurances. Journalists wanted comment. A philanthropist, always quick to gold leaf a name, invited me to a December gala as guest of honor. I said little, promised nothing, declined the gala. Reward, I decided, would not be applause. It would be the right to write the last lines. Do you see how stubborn an old man can be when his dignity returns? It's like blood coming back to a numbed hand. Sting first, then strength. Before noon, I told Maria Fletcher to meet me at the townhouse. She arrived in a navy coat, cheeks flushed, a leather portfolio under her arm. We took our coffee to the dining room, that narrow Beacon Hill room with the oil portrait of my father staring down in permanent skepticism. On the sideboard sat the object I had moved at dawn from my study, the brass ship's bell from our first warehouse on Atlantic Avenue. It was dull with age, nicked by decades of hands, and when I lifted it by the rope, it made a sound like a memory hitting bone. "That bell again," Maria said, smiling. You only bring it out when you're about to do something irrevocable. I am, I said, and I need you to be the one who makes it stick. She opened the portfolio, legal paper whispering like winter rain. We prepared contingency options. After last night, you can reconstitute the board, reissue the preferred shares, revoke certain authorizations. Not that, I said. I'm tired of moving pieces back to where they were. I want to redraw the board entirely. She waited. Careful woman, good lawyer. I liked that she didn't rush to fill my spaces. I want the company placed into a perpetual trust, I said. Not for David, not for any blood, for the work itself, for the employees, for the city that carried it. We'll keep leadership professional. Board oversight by a trust whose charter is clear. Long-term stewardship, stable wages, training, honest accounting. The trustees will include you, Bennett, one representative elected by employees, and one from the Maritime College. I will chair until death. After that, the chair rotates with supermajority consent. No child of mine, no descendant, can ever hold a majority stake again. Maria stared at the portrait of my father, as if checking whether his painted mouth twitched. Richard, she said, cautiously, that's radical. It's just old, I said. Older than greed. Call it a guild if you want. Call it penance. I call it relief. David will sue. Of course he will. But he'll lose. I tapped the portfolio. You saw the documents we dropped last night. The trusts were always mine to trigger. The conditions were written years ago back when I was still teaching. In the half-Windsor and pretending that made a father. I paused. I included a clause, Maria, and I never believed I would use it. Founder's dishonor. Do you remember? She nodded slowly, astonished I'd spoken the words aloud. I remember drafting it and thinking, he's sentimental, but careful. A clause that permits extraordinary transfer if the founder is publicly humiliated by a director in a manner that risks reputational damage and market instability. Insufferable language, I said, but effective. She considered me over the rim of her cup. This trust, what do you call it? The Bell Trust, I said, touching the rope-warm brass. So we never forget that the beginning mattered, that the sound we all followed was work. Maria smiled, and then she surprised me. There's another way to do this, if you want teeth. An employee ownership trust. Most dividends go to reinvestment. A portion becomes profit sharing. Trustees with fiduciary duty to the workforce, not to heirs. We make it airtight. Make it a story the city can understand. Boston loves its old nobility, but it also loves its workers. The story, I said, and felt the old heat of strategy. Yes, let's tell the city something decent for once. We worked until afternoon, rewriting the end of a 40-year document with the patience of a man suturing his own wound. Clauses nested within clauses. Fail-safes. Some set provisions triggered by secrecy. Maria's pencil moved like a metronome. When we finished, the house was darkening into early winter, the kind of 4 o'clock that feels like midnight. You're sure? She asked. As I'll ever be, I said. Bring Bennett. Bring the old guard and the new. Tonight if possible. Here. Tonight? She laughed softly. You operate like the ocean tides, then storm. Tonight, I said again. Before David knows where to swing. They came in ones and twos, shoulders wet with sleet, shaking their coats in the vestibule, stamping boots. Retired executives with careful cologne. A young operations manager with a knot of worry at her brow. An accountant who'd kept his head down during the recent parade of my son's confidence. In the living room, we set extra chairs, the fire clicking in the grate, and on the coffee table, the bell. I didn't mention it, but everyone noticed. No one could miss that dull gleam. Bennett took my hand longer than the others. Richard, he said, I saw the photo. I've never liked photographs, I said. He chuckled. You'll like this trust less once the committee tells you no. That's the point, I said. He grunted approval and collapsed into a chair. I spoke without theatrics, each sentence like a plank placed across cold water. I am not giving the company back to the family, I said. I am giving it forward to itself. Faces shifted, baffled, then curious, then bright with a strange relief I didn't expect. The Bell Trust will hold all voting shares. Trustees are named tonight. Profit sharing is instituted in the spring. A training fellowship to recruit kids from Charlestown, Dorchester, Easty, any place this city forgets until it needs a photo. A scholarship in my wife's name for maritime law students. The board shrinks. The charter clarifies. I looked from face to face and allowed myself a rare thing in Boston rooms. Honesty. So that my son can never again make you perform grief at your desk. No one clapped. Good. Relief expressed as quiet is the only kind that lasts. Questions? Maria asked. They had them. Fierce and practical. What about debt covenants? What about tax efficiency? What about hostile plays? We had answers. We laid out the scaffolding. And then, when the room was ready, Maria placed the final document on my dining table, pages thick as a psalter, and set a pen beside it. This is the signature that turns a man into a principal, she said. Or the opposite, I said. I did not sit. I stayed standing because it felt more like prayer that way. I read the last page in silence. Somewhere outside, a siren slid down the hill and disappeared toward Cambridge Street. Inside, the fire popped softly. My wife, who moved invisibly through rooms at the exact right time, stepped into the doorway and watched me with an expression that contained a whole marriage annoyance at my stubbornness, admiration for my audacity, fear for the space our son would now occupy in the remains of our family. I signed. That was the climax, if you want to stage it plainly. Not the ballroom speech, not even the bell, a pen on paper, pressure enough to bend your name into permanence. Would you have done it? Tell me honestly. Would you have cut your heir from the body of your labor to spare the work itself from your blood? I ask because I want absolution from someone, and the city never gives it. The doorbell rang as I lifted my hand from the page. A late arrival, I thought. I was wrong. David walked in like a man who'd learned the trick of holding anger just below the surface. He paused in the vestibule, eyes recalibrating to the familiar furniture that didn't love him back. His wife, Emily, followed close, chin high. We had been civil for years, and then for months, not even that. She was raised on the North Shore, knew how to throw charity luncheons that looked cheaper than they were. I never disliked her. I never knew her at all. You could have called, I said. You could have, David answered. His smile was the one he saved for adversaries. We heard about your performative moment at the assembly. Congratulations. Now, can we talk about reality? The reality is on the table, I said. He tracked the room like a captain evaluating an unexpected storm cell. Strangers in his father's living room. Papers fanned under the portrait. The bell. What is this? He asked, even though he already knew. A correction, I said. He didn't move toward the documents. He moved toward me. You can't build a company on the myth of family and then decide you're a monk. You tried to build it on the myth of yourself, I said. I'm simply choosing neither fiction. He looked past me to the crowd. You all comfortable with this? With an old man's tantrum rewriting your salaries? The young operations manager spoke, voice steady. I'm comfortable being paid the same year to year without the chairman's child treating our work as his personal campaign. David flinched. Emily's hand ghosted toward his sleeve, stopped, hovered, retreated. Ambition flared behind her eyes like a match struck in wind. There was a story in that hesitation, a story of a marriage tuned to the pitch of opportunity. I told you earlier I didn't know her. I did now. You're making yourself small, he said to me quietly. You think a trust is noble? It's cowardice. You're afraid to let me prove I'm better. Better at what? I asked. At ending me? You already did. You just forgot you have to keep the lights on afterward. He laughed then, a sharp sound. You taught me leverage, Father. Remember? It's almost dear to me. You leveraged me last night. Clever. But you also taught me contingency. His smile became that of a boy confessing a prank. I've been talking to Newgate Capital. Several of the older men groaned, as if an old injury had announced weather. Newgate, private equity with a talent for turning companies into spreadsheets without employees attached. You'd sell us, I said, more statement than question. I'd capitalize unrealized potential, he said, the sentence a press release that tasted like tin. They loved the narrative transition from legacy to growth. You ruined the part where I get to say family unity, but that's just a line. It's not a line, I said. It's an epitaph. He glanced at the papers, narrowed his eyes. He knew the moment was slipping. He lunged for relevance. You can't sign away my inheritance. Yes, I said gently. I can, because it was never inheritance. It was stewardship. I forgot to say the word out loud when you were young. That's my guilt. This is my correction. He said something low and unprintable. Emily didn't stop him. Emily was watching Maria now with a hunter's assessment, measuring whether a new alliance could be made from the ruins of an old one. I'll sue, he said. I'll drag you through courts until your name is only a docket number. You might win a motion, Maria said, as if noting the weather on a calendar. You might even collect a headline. But the instrument is valid. The clause is clear. And the city will not applaud a son gutting a company for sport after his father shifted it to employees. Even Newgate will frown. You think the city's your friend? He snapped. No, I said. I think it's my witness. He looked at me then without the armor of rhetoric. He looked like the boy at the kitchen table with the pencil, all calculation and want. I felt my chest crack with a tenderness that had nowhere to go. Then what's left for me? He asked. The question was naked. Emily turned her face slightly, as if turning away from a naked man. What would you have said? Give me the line you think redeems both of us. You won't find it. Not at this age. Not at this hour. The best I had was truth that didn't comfort. There's work, I said. Real work. You can become the kind of leader people follow out of respect, not fear, but not here. Not now. Not with my money. I'll endow you one thing, an experiment. I nodded to Maria, who lifted another folder from her portfolio. The warehouse on Atlantic Avenue. I transferred it this morning from the company's portfolio to a new nonprofit incubator. You'll be one trustee among many. No salary for the first year. The incubator will fund maritime startups, pay for apprenticeships, give grants to poor communities. If you want your name on something, make it worth the sign. He stared at the folder as if it were a small animal that might bite him. You're giving me a ruin. I'm giving you a chance to build without me as your scaffolding, I said. If you make something honest there, I'll write a letter to the trustees that I misjudged you. If you strip it, I'll ring this bell and publish the letter I wrote today instead. What letter? He asked, wary. I nodded at the ship's bell. Beneath it, on the table, lay an envelope with his name. I slid it across the wood, to scrape loud as thunder in that quiet room. A father's document, I said. Not a legal one, a document of memory. In case I die before we're right with each other. He did not reach for it. The refusal hurt more than the boardroom. He turned to leave, then turned back because pride is a complicated compass. You want the city to validate you? He asked. You have it. You want the company to survive? Maybe it will. But you've lost me. I lost you long ago, I said. Today I stopped pretending otherwise. The door closed behind him, and in the old house, the draft of winter slithered under it like a comment you can't unsay. Emily lingered in the vestibule a beat longer, then went after him with the quick steps of someone who hears two clocks ticking and chooses the louder one. No one spoke for a while. Finally, Bennett cleared his throat. You'll catch hell for that. I've lived in hell more politely for months, I said. We finished the formalities. The trustees signed. The notary stamped. Papers slid into folders that would outlive our bones. When the last person left, the house exhaled. I stood alone with the bell. I lifted it, and quietly, carefully so as not to wake the neighbors, I rang it once. The note filled the room, then traveled beyond it, into stairwell, into street, into a city made of echoes. That's all a bell ever is. A container for echoes. Was the price too high? I ask you because asking myself has no end. I could have engineered a more palatable revenge, something that left us sharing roast beef at Christmas, while lawyers executed the fine print. Instead, I chose a bruising honesty. I put the company beyond his reach. I put my love where he could not spend it. In the weeks that followed, the story did what stories do here. It climbed brownstone stoops, sat at bar tables, fluttered across church pews. Some called me a saint. More called me a fool. A handful used the word patricide in reverse. David made noise and then, to my surprise, less noise. The incubator got its papers and its tax status. The old warehouse acquired heat again and a coat of paint. A group of apprentices from Charleston clattered across the floor in boots too new. Their laughter got caught in the beams and shook dust loose like season's first rain. The company stabilized. Profit-sharing checks arrived in small, solid envelopes. No one sent me flowers. Good. Work is its own bouquet. I walk now like a man who has placed a heavy object on a high shelf and keeps expecting it to fall. Some nights I wake and listen for it. Instead, I hear the city-distant sirens, a late bus grinding gears, the soft argument of wind against brick. Boston will not bless me. It will not curse me either. It will observe, the way it always has, and that is enough. A witness is better than a statue. Sometimes, in the afternoons, I take my coat and walk to Atlantic Avenue. The incubator staff wave through the glass. I wave back but rarely go inside. From the sidewalk, I can see David now and then. He stands beside a whiteboard, sleeves rolled, explaining supply chain to kids who have never left Massachusetts and to engineers who have never touched a rope. He looks earnest. He looks tired. He looks like me when I was kinder. Do I forgive him? Not yet. Do I love him? That question offends me. Love is not a verdict. It's weather. It returns when it wants. Last week, as I passed the warehouse, he came out and stopped 3 feet from me. There were so many words we could have chosen. We selected almost none. How's the trust? He asked. Stubborn, I said. It refuses to please whoever shouts. We stood with our hands in our pockets like 2 men waiting for a bus that would never come. He glanced at the bell rope I had hung inside the door for ceremony. He nodded at it, as if at a familiar star. I read your letter, he said then, not looking at me. What did it say? I asked. That you remember the first time I held a clipboard more than the first time I held a baseball, he said. And that you're sorry. I am, I said. He shifted his weight, a boy again for half a second, then not. I'm not ready, he said. I know, I said. He went back inside. I kept walking. That evening, at home, I placed the ship's bell on the fireplace mantel central, heavy, unmissable. I sat in my chair with the last light of day flattening itself across the carpet. I thought of the will I had written once for inheritance and the New Testament of work I had signed instead. I thought of the tremor in my son's voice that wasn't quite anger and wasn't yet grief. I will not lie to you. The reward was not sweet. It was stern. It tasted like the sea salt and iron and a little blood. But it steadied me, and in that steadiness, there was a new balance I could stand on without reaching for a son who might push me off again. If I have a final gesture to offer, small, meaningful, the kind that carries its own silence, it is this. At night, before the house grows entirely dark, I touch the bell rope once with my forefinger and thumb. I do not ring it. I let the fibers rough my skin. I say out loud, to no one and to the house and to you, I chose to rise. Listen, isn't that wrong too? To rise at the cost of a child? Or is it merely the price of telling the truth late? I don't know. I only know that the pen felt heavy, the bell feels heavier, and the city will keep our secrets until the next tide. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.